just enjoy their lives in a new location. We pray that this move would give them peace. It would help them with their health situations, that they have care closer and more readily available, Lord. We also want to pray for the organization that Sister Josie mentioned. We pray for unity so that they can continue to help and provide for their members and continue to do good work on their behalf. Or we also pray for Sister Jarrett, who is has just undergone a stroke. Lord, we pray that she can get into physical therapy soon, that she can regain function in her body, and that you would just heal her so that she can soon be with us again. Lord, we just pray for all those we haven't mentioned, that they will healed or comforted in whatever way they need to be, and that we can be a part of that. It's in your Son's name, Jesus, we pray this thing.
She's in the Olympic wings, room 782.
782. I think we could get an update out to
As
everybody.
of yesterday.
Yeah, if you could just let me know how she's doing, I'll make sure that goes out.
What?
If you could just make sure to let me know how she's doing, I'll send an email out. Okay, so the homework for this week was to look through 1 Chronicles 3 through 9, everybody's favorite passage, everybody's favorite 6 chapters, 7 chapters of genealogy, and find some nuggets to share with the rest of us. So, what did we find, Ms. Joyce?
Well, just some humor. I was in the middle of reading Chronicles one night this week, and my son called me and he said, "Did I wake you up?" I said, "No, I'm reading Chronicles."
So it wasn't clear whether he woke you up or not.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. That's good. Did anybody notice anything interesting or something that stood out? So this is my talking to. I'm going to give everybody a talking to right now. Maybe you did the homework and you just didn't find anything interesting. But one thing that we're trying to do here at Springbrook is change the culture, especially within our classes. And so we're kind of raising the expectations. And so Paul and I are going to be assigning homework like this. And we're not trying to do something crazy. It's not an hour or two a night. It's just going to be 10 to 15 minutes every day. But I think that if you commit to doing that while you're in this class, you're going to get a much richer experience, and you're going to benefit to a much greater degree than if you don't. And so, you can come here and just listen to me and Paul talk for an hour a week, but that's really not going to have the richness of being in the Word about what we're studying and then coming prepared to class, ready to discuss and think more deeply about that stuff. So that's my one talking to. I try and just do it like once a quarter, keep everybody talking. And so that being said, no, Bobby, it's too late.
Well, I did
Nope, it's too late. Go
find a few
home.
things, but I
Okay.
kind of had catching up to do because I wanted to, I wasn't here last week, so I tried to go my way through the first 3 and then, or the first 2, but I did, so in 1 Chronicles chapter 3, I did get a little bit into there, but it seems like when 1 Chronicles chapter 3, the first part, he started talking about David's sons, but from all the different wives, and he did it geographically. First, the wives that were in Hebron, and then the wives that were from Jerusalem, were the sons. And the numbers seem to be like 6 or, well, David was the 7th son, so that was very interesting. And then 6 sons from Hebron and 13 plus 1 daughter, making 14 from Jerusalem. That was kind of interesting. but he didn't mention Solomon at the first. It was like he was kind of the afterthought, or that wasn't the first thing that was talked about.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, no, those are all really good observations, really good close reading of chapter 3. And so, you know, we could think about why he's mentioning them in that order, the numbers of them, all that kind of stuff is good. Why Solomon is not seen to be front and center, but we know that he's going to be the heir later. So all those things are interesting to consider. So I was going to come up with mine, but thank you for bringing one of yours, Bobby. That's very good. So let's start this week's class. So this week's class, we're not going to be starting in 1 Chronicles 10 quite yet. I want to do an overview of narrative and what a narrative is and how to read narrative well. So we're gonna talk about that a lot this class, and we're actually going to take one of the stories that is in 1 Samuel chapter 31, and we're going to look at that because it's the same narrative that's in 1 Chronicles chapter 10, but it's been changed in very slight, small ways. So it's going to be part of our homework is to kind of compare those this week, as well as begin reading the rest of the first portion of Chronicles here. So hopefully you got a worksheet, because I'm going to be talking a lot about the worksheet, and there's stuff to fill out on the worksheet this week. So not mandatory that you do that, but it's going to be helpful to understand what I'm talking about as I talk through the way the narrative works. So does anybody speak French in here? I don't speak French either. But from what I understand, this says, this is not a pipe. Okay. And why would this picture say this is not a pipe?
Because there's some other message here.
Okay.
It's a picture of a
It's not a pipe, it's a picture of a pipe. Okay. And that's the whole point of this little exercise, is to think about how a narrative or how a picture or how anything that we might see is not the thing itself. Okay? And that's, I think, an important thing to remember as we're reading the Bible for narrative, but also for any genre, is that the thing that the people are telling us about is not the text itself. Right? The text is representing, it's telling us something about something that happened a long time ago, but it's not the thing itself. And so this is helping remind us that this is not a pipe, this is a representation of a pipe. Okay? And so what that has to do with the Bible is that the Bible is going to tell us about things that happen in history, but they're not the thing itself. And so have I talked to you all about essences and energies yet? So I found this very helpful, for me at least. Maybe this won't be as helpful for you, but this is kind of how I've been thinking about it. Because one of the problems with the Enlightenment, so the past 200-300 years of our modern thinking, some of the things that have gone wrong, is that in a lot of ways especially when we start talking about history, is people thought that they could figure out in history the exact thing that happened. They could know everything about a particular event by studying it from different angles. And so no one angle had the absolute truth. They all had some sort of perspective or some sort of slant to them. And so studying history was this, this undertaking where you would go and you would read something, but you knew you wouldn't trust it. You would say, well, this has all sorts of biases, and this was written from, a particular perspective in order to maintain power or some sort of leverage over other people. And so I think that's a really foolish undertaking and a really poor way to do history. But that's a very influential way of thinking about history. And so I think it sometimes infects the way that we think about history, is that if we have a historical record of some kind, a critical scholar, that's what they're called, critical scholars, because they look at these records with a critical eye, looking for the biases and looking for how things aren't so. And so they look at them and they say, no, King David never existed, or this is just stuff that the Jewish people made up. They made up their history to make themselves look better than they are. Which is funny because if you read the Bible, that's definitely not what the Bible is, making the Israelites look better than they are. But the point is that in response to those people saying that, sometimes we go to the other extreme and say, no, this is the absolute thing. This is exactly what happened, which has its own problems, because that tells us that confuses this idea, right? That the Bible is the thing itself and not a representation of the thing itself. And so when I say essences and energies, I think this is a good way to think about it, because we can know, and we can just think about this as like personal relationships, okay? So you all can know me, but you can't know the essence of me, because I barely know that myself. Like what it's like to be me and what I'm thinking and what I care about and all those kinds of things, right? So you can know the energies. So you can know kind of the outward things that come out of my mouth when I'm talking, or when I teach a class, or when you interact with me, or when we play a game. You know more about me, but you never know the essence of me, right? And it's the same way with anything, right? We can kind of know about a bat, but we don't know what it's like to be a bat, right? And so having this distinction between the essence and the energies of something, I think is a helpful distinction, especially when we read the Bible, because we can know some of the energies, so we can know some of the things that result from what happened, and the Bible is providing a truthful and honest perspective on something that happened, and it's trying to teach us and shape us about something, but it's not the thing itself, and it's not like a video camera footage of what's going on. I don't know, is this helpful? Does this distinction matter? Is there confusion about that? When I say the essence of something, so we can't really know the essence of something that happened in history. There's no, even if we have video camera footage of stuff, like that's still problematic in court, right? People have video camera footage of things happening, and there's still argument about what actually happened, because we can't really know the essence of something. Yeah.
I think we struggle with it sometimes when we see maybe the Kings and the Chronicles not lining up exactly right.
Yeah.
And then I think we're of the mind that somehow we have to figure out, how do we reconcile what we read here with what we read here, and they don't seem the same, or they're not exactly the same.
Yeah.
But if we understand they were written that way for a purpose, because it's telling this part of the story and emphasizing these things in that, then the two work together to give us a picture of what God wants us to learn.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's definitely helpful as we think about Second Samuel, 1 Kings in relation to 1 Chronicles, as we're going to read through there. That's going to be one way to reconcile what's going on, right? That these different authors are writing for different purposes, and so they're going to give us different accounts, or at least maybe tell us different stories, exclude some information, include new information, all that kind of stuff. Is anybody else unclear about what I'm talking about? I really want to know if this is making sense or not making sense at all.
Well, even when Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, we understand that means the Father in his intent and in his expressions of love, but we haven't seen God in all his glory and in all his glory.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's where this terminology at least comes from, is kind of a ancient orthodoxy in that we can't know God in his essence, but we can know him in his energies. And so God has acted by becoming a human, Jesus Christ. So So we can know God in the things that Jesus said and did, but we can't know God in his essence, just because that's, hopefully we all understand that's outside of our capability. Even if we did have more information, more stuff, we just aren't capable of understanding God in his totality.
Well, these assigned scriptures here, chapters 3 through 9, are not, I don't have the French, but they are not just a genealogy.
Right.
I mean, when we sit down and read these, sometimes we say, what's the most boring passage in the entire Bible that you can find? And you'd say, well, 3 through 9, just a genealogy. But God had them written down because he never forgot a single tribe, he never forgot a single householder, and he was faithful throughout as long as they were faithful. So it's a powerful testimony that's just like a jackhammer, bang, 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 bang. God is faithful, God is faithful. Never forgot one of them.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, and the genealogies are representing that faithfulness, right?
So it's not just a genealogy.
Yep. So okay, so I'm going to move on if that kind of makes sense to everybody. So the narrative. Okay, so what is a narrative? Does anybody have a good definition? I have a good definition from Lamplighters.
It's different than a genealogy.
It's different than a genealogy. That's good.
Finally.
Thankfully. Any ideas?
It's a storyline.
Yeah, it's a storyline. In Lamplighters, we say it's a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Okay. All stories have beginning, middles, and ends. Well, that's not true. Some people tell stories without a beginning, or without a middle, and without an end, and that's a bad story. It's not really a story because it doesn't have those things. And if you listen to somebody that tells a story that doesn't have a beginning, a middle, and an end, you kind of wish it had an end, right? Because it's like, this doesn't make sense. What's the point? What's the purpose? I don't understand what happened, or sometimes the story ends. Like, I've done that before. I've started telling a story, and I realized the story doesn't have an end. I just thought something was interesting, and so I started talking, and then I have to, like, try and make up an end to the story on the fly. Or sometimes it's just like, and then we all went on, right? So it's like not a good story. But this is how narratives work, and this is how we kind of relate to the world in and through narratives, because we are ourselves. We're kind of the main character in our own story, and so I wake up in the morning, something happens to me, and I have a goal for the day, and I'm trying to work towards that goal, and then I encounter obstacles on the way. At some point, something happens where I'm able to accomplish my goal, and then at the end of the day, I either resolved my problem, I resolved the thing I was trying to do, or I didn't, and then I go to sleep, and the next day it happens all again. Okay? Or maybe there's small stories within those stories as well. So this is kind of how we experience life, and so it's not a surprise to us then that the Bible is 40% stories, it's 40% narratives, because that's how we go through our life. And so the narratives in the Bible, how do they work to affect us? What's the purpose of these narratives? And there's many purposes. There's not one purpose. What are some of the purposes of these narratives?
One might be we're trying to understand God as he presents himself.
Yep. Yep, I think that's absolutely right. So God is, so we can't understand who God is in his essence, but we can understand him in his energies, right? So he has presented a lot of these stories with himself in the stories, interacting with the characters, guiding events, helping things along, so we understand how God interacts with us, how God works in the world, how we might partner with him to accomplish his ends. So that's a great answer. What else?
Like, is there a line of importance in these different families and clans and tribes?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons that Judah's tribe comes first and then describes David's line is that's going to be the point of the upcoming stories. You can put that down, Dirk. I don't need that anymore. Yep.
And I think knowing about when to recognize the Messiah, and God talks about it all through the Old Testament, and not till later, after you read the whole book, it's like, wow. And then they have this linking to scripture God said in Genesis.
Yeah.
You know, and so you start adding those up, and then Isaiah, and then it just like, why didn't you understand when you was there?
Yeah, so I think there's things like the Messiah and all these hints and details that are throughout the Old Testament and in the narratives that are repeating patterns that we ought to pick up on, to pay attention to learn more about God and His Messiah. There's also the aspect of learning about ourselves, right? Learning about humans, because that's one of the best things about a good story, is that it's going to teach you, it might teach you about God, but it also might teach you about yourself, right? So even though somebody else wrote it about somebody else doing something else that you've never seen before, you might learn something about, oh yeah, humans are that way. I'm that way. I fall into those traps. I do those things that are bad. And I learn more about myself and maybe how I should or shouldn't act in the world based on a good story, a good true story that's true to who humans are and how we exist.
And I think we use stories through generations to give continuity to our identity, who we are and where we came from and why we are why we are.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and so when people don't like the Old Testament, or when people shy away from the Old Testament, it blows my mind, because this is our story. This is what ought to be our story and who we are, where we came from. And if we're not connecting with it, then I don't understand why you like the New Testament, because the New Testament is fully rooted in the Old Testament. That's where it all comes from. That's why Jesus can say He is the Christ, because the Christ was promised to Abraham, and it was promised to Adam and Eve as they left the garden, that one day there would be a conqueror who would overcome sin. So I just like that a lot.
I guess I would just add to that,
Yep.
you can't appreciate the Old Testament without the New Testament. Without Christ, then we can't appreciate the Old Testament. The only reason that I know that creation happened is because Jesus told me that it happened. From a historical sense.
Yeah, I think, I would phrase it that Jesus is the climax of the whole biblical story.
Right.
Without Jesus, the Old Testament's kind of a downer, right?
Exactly.
That we're going to have this Messiah, we're going to have this thing coming, and it doesn't ever come.
Right.
Yeah. So I would absolutely agree that Jesus brings this whole storyline, and he really brings it to a conclusion in Revelation, but it's brought to its climax in the Gospels.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, so let's fill this out. Okay, so you got a chart in front of you that kind of looks like this. Okay, so the three parts that we've already mentioned are the beginning, the middle, and end, and that's kind of already put down below in those little things. Sorry, it's small. Normally it's landscape, and so it's a little easier to kind of fill in. So I can send this out as a digital copy to everybody. I find this tool very helpful to organize my thoughts as I'm reading through narratives. It's a good way to capture kind of what's going on in every story. So what I want you to do is in the top left four boxes, I want you to put setup, right? Setup or introduction by those top four boxes. And then the bottom left red box, you're going to label that one problem. Okay? On the slope that goes from the problem up to the middle red box, on that slope, below that, right, rising action. Excuse me. The very top middle box, it's called the climax or the turn of the story. And then the slope down is called the falling action. The bottom right red box is called the resolution. And then the top right four boxes is the conclusion. Okay. So whenever we encounter a story, a good story that makes sense, it almost always has all this information. So if you have a friend that's not very good at telling stories, it's probably because they miss out on parts of this information. Maybe they don't give you enough setup. And so in the setup, what kind of things are you going to find out in the setup, or the introduction to the story?
Setting.
You're going to have the setting.
Introduction of the characters.
Yep, all the characters, all the important characters that we need to know for this beginning of the story to happen. So we might find out new characters as the story goes on, but we're definitely going to have enough information about the characters to know what's going on. Let's see, character, and then you also might get some extraneous information that you need to know for the story to make sense. That's going to usually be in the introduction. And then the problem. So the problem is sometimes challenging to figure out exactly what's going on or what the problem is in a story. And so as you encounter the problem, just remember that the problem is going to be the main problem. So there might be a series of problems in a story, but the main problem is the biggest problem. It's going to kind of be involved with the climax. So the climax is going to turn it from everything's terrible and getting worse to, oh, things are getting a little bit better and we might be able to solve this problem, right? So that's something that happens in almost every story. It has this kind of turning point, and then the resolution is going to be the main resolution to the main problem. So there might be smaller problems, and some of those problems might get fixed, but the biggest Harkin problem that's there is the main problem that's going to be key to understanding what's going on.
Judges is a good example of that,
Yep, how so?
where throughout the book of Judges, you had a different setup, but the same basic problem each time.
Yeah.
Another setup, another set of characters, another context, another culture, but the same basic problem. And the resolution was God's faithfulness again, but it really didn't change the heart of man. So you had the basic problem and then the actual problem, what was really at the root of the whole thing. So
Yeah.
just in a rotating cyclical fashion there.
Yeah, so, and, we call it the Judges cycle because we go through this arc over and over again, right? Or this
Downward arc.
cycle, yeah, and it gets worse because the problem gets
What do you
worse.
call it? Not the rising action.
Yeah, well, this is, I don't know what because the falling action in some sense is like fixing the problem. So this is getting worse and worse and worse with each cycle. And Judges is a funny book because what it does is it takes the standard Judges cycle and it gives it to you in chapter 2, and it's like very clear, and then it plays on that cycle over and over again, getting worse. And Judges is like this very disheartening book because things are in shambles at the end of Judges, right? You don't get a resolution. You don't get any happy feelings at the end of Judges. It's like we killed off almost an entire tribe of Israelites, and things are horrible, and there's still no king in Israel.
That's why God gave us the book of Ruth.
Yeah, a little pick me up before we get into Samuel. Okay, so we talked about the problem. So the rising action is characterized by things getting worse and worse. Okay, and that's common in a story, and hopefully you'll start to realize this in all of our stories. So this is true to the Bible, but it's also true in movies. If you watch a movie and there's a main problem that a character encounters, that problem gets worse and worse and worse until something happens which turns the story and things start getting better and better and better until there's a resolution. Sometimes in our modern storytelling, we like to kind of stick the climax much closer to the end of the story, so things are going to get better and better very quickly after the climax happened, and that's just kind of a hack so that we can, it just makes it really clear what the climax is, right? Really clear what has turned this whole thing around as a storytelling device, okay? And so during the falling action, things get better and better until the resolution, okay? And then in the conclusion, you'll sometimes get details to wrap up loose ends to help you understand something important that the author wants you to know, or information that you'll need to know for future stories, okay? So if you look on the back of your paper, I put, so when I went through my narrative class on this, on the book of Samuel, I tried to picture it as a whole story, a series of stories that fit together, okay? So we're going to look at 1 Samuel chapter 31 now. So if you would turn there with me. And then what we're going to try and do is we're going to look at this one single story. But I also gave you that whole storyline so you can kind of see that this is one chapter that fits into this larger narrative that is actually about Samuel, Saul, and David, right? That's what the books of First and Second Samuel are about these three major leaders of Israel and how their stories rise and fall together. Okay, so let's start reading. Can somebody read the first, let's call it 7 verses. So it's 1 Samuel 31, 1 through 7.
Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them and they fell dead on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and the fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and run it through me, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor bearer and all his men died together that same day. When the Israelites along the valley and those who crossed the Jordan saw that the Israelite army had fled, and that Saul and his sons had died, they abandoned their towns and fled. The Philistines came and occupied them.
Okay, so we just read the first half of this story. So if we're thinking about this as a narrative, which we ought to be because we're reading a historical narrative, where do these things fit? So when we're filling out this chart, one thing that's helpful is to write in pencil, because we might have one idea when we start the thing, but then as we read through the story, maybe the author is going to surprise us. Maybe he's going to do something strange. And so we ought to change our perspective on exactly what's going on, halfway through the story. But just with the first 7 verses, where do you think the main problem is? What are some candidates for the main problem? There's lots of problems here. Are things getting better in this story or worse? Yep, they're getting worse. Things not going good. What are some candidates for the main problem that we see here?
Well, David's beloved friend Jonathan has died.
Okay, so the sons of Saul are killed in battle. Saul himself is killed.
The Israelites are losing to the Philistines.
Yeah, so the Philistines are attacking the Israelites. Okay. So those are all, let's keep all those in our mind, right? So all those are problems. And what did we say was key for understanding what the main problem is? The main problem always has some sort of, has a resolution, okay? So if we think it's the main problem, then the author better bring it up and give us some sort of resolution. So sometimes the resolution is like a positive resolution, right? So like this happened and then it was fixed later. Or this happened and then something even better was fixed it to make things much better. But sometimes in a story like Judges, things don't get better, they get worse. And so the resolution is actually this, event X was even worse. But the author is going to tell us about it, okay? Because the author wants us to understand what the story is about. Okay, so let's keep reading. Starting verse 8 to the end of the chapter.
It came about on the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And they cut off his head and stripped off his weapons, and they sent them throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to the house of their idols and to the people. They put his weapons in the temple of Asheroth. They fastened his body to the wall in Bethshan. Now when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men rose and walked all night, and they took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the walls of Bethshan, and they came to Jabesh and burned them there, buried them there. And they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and then they fasted for 7 days.
Does yours say burned or buried?
Buried.
Mine says burned.
My mistake.
No, mine says burned, so, which is interesting. So, okay, so when does the story turn? When does something change and start getting a little bit better? Like, Saul's not coming back from the dead, but the story does turn. Where does that happen?
The valiant men of Israel
Yeah.
rose up, recovered the body, and ended the desecration, and honored Saul and his sons with a decent burial.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so here we have this quick, this very close to the end climax, and then the resolution is what? And I think it's actually part of what you said.
A respectful burial,
Yeah.
even though Saul had really shamed himself.
Yeah.
So there's some, well, the whole chapter is, it's a good day to be a Philistine,
Mhm.
bad day to be an Israelite.
Yeah, just as a side note, the word good news there, that's how ancient people use that term, good news. There's good news when you win a battle. There's good news when you defeat a king. There's good news when something happens. So when you see that in the New Testament, it's the same kind of idea. The good news is that Jesus is Lord. The good news is that Jesus has conquered.
That's the good news.
He's
Holding
won.
up the head of Saul is good news for the Philistines. It's terrible news
Yeah.
for the children of Israel. So you're looking at the same image, the same representation. It's good news.
So, okay, so we just talked through it, but somebody just sum it up. So what's the setup? What's the problem? What's the climax? What's the resolution? One brave soul.
The setup is the final battle between the Philistines and the Israelites, the final battle.
We don't know it's a final battle yet, right?
This is the final battle,
It is, but we don't know that at the beginning of the story. They don't say that.
yeah. Until all bodies are counted.
Yeah. So that's the setup, and then what's the main problem?
Saul kills, well, the main problem.
Saul's fallen out of favor with God.
So you said Saul's fallen out of favor with God. What'd you say?
Saul and his clan were defeated.
Yeah. So he's wounded in battle, and there's no escape, right? He's in some sort of situation where he can't get out of this battle. All of his sons are fallen on the field, right? So it's the end of Saul's line, so to speak. He's wounded, and then we said the climax was when we pull his body down from the wall, right? The brave men go in the middle of the night. They do this rescue mission to pull his body, the bodies of his sons, off the wall, and then we give them a proper burial in his hometown. Okay. And that's the resolution. So it's this honoring of Saul resolves this problem of being stuck and captured, beheaded, hung up on the wall, right? And it resolves all that issue of dishonor by being buried with your ancestors. That's the idea there. Okay. So we're kind of out of time, but how does the shape of this story change the meaning of this story? Or how does the shape of this story give it meaning? So David touched on this a little bit already by saying that because we know chapters 1 through 30, we know where Saul comes from, we know who Saul is and what kind of person he was, how he treated David, all that kind of stuff, how he treated the Lord's anointed, the king that was promised to come after him. So we know all those things about Saul. So knowing that and knowing the shape of this story, how does that shape the meaning that the author is trying to help us understand about God or about us as people?
I would think both.
What's that?
I would think both.
Yeah, in what way?
Because with Saul, he got too much in his head on himself. We get that one too. And we have to humble ourselves, even though we may converse to that time of an age. And realize that, you don't supersede God.
Yeah.
He'll bring down if you don't do yourself. But also, it made an opening for David, because David wasn't about to put a hand to the king. He really honored him, no matter what he was like.
Yep.
And, today, you blaspheme our politicians and our governors and that, and we don't agree with them. But God's the one, the scriptures teach that where they are, for a day that will come.
Yep.
And God will handle that.
Yep.
We don't have to worry.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what this story is telling us, is that this man Saul, who elevated himself, disregarded God's instructions, who has tried to get rid of God's anointed, who's tried to elevate his own sons to a place that they're not going to be, he now suffers this disgraceful death at the hands of his enemies. But God did anoint him to be the king of Israel, and so his bones will be brought back and buried with his ancestors. So God is going to be faithful even though Saul is faithless, and that there are real and serious consequences for faithlessness, but God will be faithful in the end.
So that's the interesting thing about people from Jabesh Gilead. If you go back, then those are the people that before Saul was king, he saved them from the hands of a bad king who was going to gouge out their eyes in order to make a treaty with them. They didn't want to do that, so Saul defeated that king to save the people from Jabesh Gilead, and then that was one good thing he did right before he became king, and this is one good thing they did for him after he was.
Yeah.
That's kind of another interesting part of this story.
Yeah, and on your summary sheet on the back of your paper, I have little tiny pictures, because throughout 1st and 2nd Samuel, there's all these little tiny details that come up in 2 or 3 spots, like somebody calls another person a dog or something like that, and that happens multiple times. And so reading those stories in relation to each other, very fascinating. We're 5 minutes over. Thank you all for your attention this morning. Thank you for this class. Appreciate it.